Ukraine. This generous gesture now made the Ukrainians co-responsible for the fate of the Crimean Tatars. Tatars, who constituted the indigenous population of the Crimea, had been brutally deported to Central Asia in 1944 by the order of Stalin, under the pretext of their alleged collaboration with the Nazis during the war. The falsehood of this accusation was finally admitted in 1967. The movement of the Crimean Tatars, under the leadership of a prominent dissident, Mustafa Dzhemilev, waged a lengthy struggle for their right to return to their native Crimea. The Tatars started returning on a mass scale only at the end of the 80s. At present, about 200,000 Tatars live within the Ukraine in the Crimean Autonomous Republic, although many problems still remain unsolved. We proceed from the belief that the Ukraine has to acknowledge, according to the constitution, that the Crimean Tatars belong to the indigenous people of the Ukraine, with all the legal consequences ensuing from this acknowledgement. The 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956 and the secret report of Nikita Khrushchev ushered in a new epoch in the history of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev criticized at great length the personality cult of Stalin and openly referred to his crimes, mass terror and repression. Although Soviet foreign policy maintained a hard line and the Soviet Union sent troops to Budapest in 1956 in order to suppress popular anti-government demonstrations, the internal policy relaxed slightly and the period of the so-called thaw began. A whole generation of young intellectuals arose in the Ukraine known as the 60ists: Lina Kostenko, Ivan Drach, Dmytro Pavlichko, Alla Gorska, Vasyl Stus, Irina and Igor Kalinets, Ivan Djuba, and many others shaped and modeled in the following 30 years the center for the development of oppositional thought. They called for the guaranteed freedom of creative activities, for the development of national culture, and for rehabilitation of the victims of Stalinist purges, including writers banned in the 1930s. Khrushchev's epoch was also a time of experimentation in the economy. The large-scale project of developing uncultivated and neglected lands, or the notorious maize campaign, brought about dubious if not disastrous results. However, there were also some victories. The Soviet Union launched the first satellite into space, and in 1961 Yuri Gagarin was the first man to orbit the Earth in a spaceship. A Ukrainian, Sergei Korolev, the constructor general of Soviet spacecraft, played a great role in those achievements. The conquest of space was enthusiastically acclaimed all over the Soviet Union. Before long, the first Ukrainian cosmonaut, Pavlo Popovich, went into space. However, numerous failures in the home and foreign policy, such as the confrontation with the USA in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the breaking off of relations with China, and the hardships caused by a poor harvest in 1963, resulted in Nikita Khrushchev being dismissed from power. In 1964, Leonid Brezhnev became leader of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev's rule of almost 2 decades was a period of economic stagnation, Russification, and corresponding limitation of the Union's republic's rights. Khrushchev's 10-year rule radically changed the Soviet Union. Partial de-Stalinization and partial rehabilitation of his victims were carried out. Although the Gulag kept functioning and the dissidents were being locked up in mental hospitals, mass terror was brought to an end and political murder became less common. To a certain extent, the thaw in the Ukraine outlived Khrushchev's reign, but the first indications of a much harder line, Russification of education, together with political prosecution in the western Ukraine, appeared in the last years of his rule. One of Khrushchev's last decisions, significant for the Ukraine, was the appointment of Petro Shelest as the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party Central Committee. Shelest was a stalwart communist whose top priority had always been the interests of the Soviet state. However, he could never reconcile himself with the Ukraine's status as a Soviet colony, so he consistently sought to guard its interests in the Soviet Union. Shelest believed that along with economic development, the granting of greater freedom to Ukrainians in the sphere of culture and language would benefit both the Ukraine and the Soviet Union. The general opinion that Shelest tolerated the 60ists and even sympathized with them is supported by the fact that repressions were rather limited during his time in power and the thaw continued. Without doubt, he also pursued personal goals in his policy. The increased importance of the Soviet Ukraine would have simultaneously reinforced his own position in central party bodies. The arrests and prosecutions of the young intellectuals in the 1960s were the reaction of the authorities to the growing activities of the 60ists. The power structures of the state could not put up with either samizdat, the unauthorized publications, or their contacts with the Ukrainian diaspora in Western Europe, the United States and Canada. It was through these very channels that the main work of the dissident movement, Ivan Duba's Internationalism or Russification, became renowned in the Ukraine and abroad. The author, quoting Marx, Engels and Lenin, criticized Russification practices in the Ukraine and provided the opposition with the legal arguments for criticizing the leadership. Alongside the rebellious intellectuals, an independent workers' rights movement was being formed. As far back as the early 60s, strikes used to break out in various towns of both the eastern and western Ukraine. Unfortunately, these two movements didn't coordinate their efforts. They acted separately and failed to give birth to such a phenomenon as the Polish Solidarity movement. It was only 30 years later that the two streams joined to become a force which affected the future of the entire Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the expanding autonomy of the Soviet Ukraine under Petro Shelest began to disturb the Kremlin. Shelest, accused of the lenience towards Ukrainian nationalism, was quickly losing influence to Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, who embarked on a campaign aimed at crushing the Ukrainian intelligentsia at the beginning of 1972, and only a few months later superseded Shelest as the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party Central Committee. Within several months, Chornovil, Stus, Duba, Kalinin, Svitlitsky, Sverstyuk and almost 100 other prominent figures of the Ukrainian nationalist and cultural renaissance found themselves in prisons and camps. The punishment was monstrously harsh compared to the crime, from 8 to 12 years of imprisonment. The generation of the 1960s was crushed. One part of the activists became extremely radical and went underground. A handful of people joined the dissident movement by setting up the Ukrainian Helsinki Group, and thus continued fighting for human rights in the Ukraine. Although very soon most of them were arrested and exiled, the group persevered in its activities. In 1988, it was reformed as the Ukrainian Helsinki Union, the first oppositionist organization in the Soviet Ukraine that acted publicly. After the removal of Shelest, nothing prevented the authorities from Russification of education, reducing the number of Ukrainian newspapers, magazines and publishing houses, or from making professional careers and promotion dependent upon a person's knowledge of the Russian language. A new community was being formed, the Soviet people. So any manifestation of patriotism was regarded as an example of socially dangerous nationalism and separatism. Anything with a hint of the past cultural originality of the Ukrainians was either banned or destroyed. This was only relaxed at the